Hi everyone, in this lesson we're going to talk about variable scope. Variable scope defines the accessibility of a variable from different parts of the code. In JavaScript we have two main scopes, local and global. So let's start with the local scope. I'm just going to copy this function so we can use it as an example. So going back to Visual Studio Code, let's create this function called create name. It's just a very simple example. So now inside this function, we are creating this variable. Let's try a different name like person's name. And now let's execute this function once. So when we do this, let's save this. And let's refresh the page, we can see that we are sending this value to the console. So following the logic, when we execute this function for the first time, we just created this variable. So now we should be able to access this variable directly. So now we can just try to use it outside of this function. If we do this, let's save this and refresh the page. As you can see now, we have an error. JavaScript is telling us that this variable called person's name is not defined. This is because outside of functions is the global scope, and we never created this variable in the global scope. This is only accessible from inside this function. So this also means that before we had this function, if we had a variable, so let's just create a variable with the same name. So if you have a big website with a lot of functions, sometimes you may repeat variable names. So variables like price, product, photo, product image, or something like this. Maybe these names, they repeat on different parts of the code. So when you work with the local scope, you won't have conflict between these variables. So now I'm just going to create one here. Let's assign John to it. And now I'm just going to run this and let's see what do we see in the console. So as you can see, there were no conflicts between these variables, even though they have the same names. One is a global variable that you can access from anywhere in the code, and another one is just a local variable that belongs to this function. Now let's try to change this example a little bit. So I'm going to erase this function. Instead of using a function, I'm just going to use an if statement. So I'm just going to create an if, and here I'm going to use the value of true just so I can go inside this loop. And now I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to create this variable from inside here. I'm going to send it to the console, and then I'm going to send that original variable. So let's see what happens in this case. Refreshing the page. So now we can see that we just replaced the value of that variable. So why did it happen? Well, this is because only functions have local scope. So this is not a function, this is an if statement. So any variable we create here is going to be part of the global scope. So since we use the same name, it's just replacing the variable that already existed. Well, this led to a lot of problems. So I'm going to show you one problem that can happen when you have this kind of conflicts. So I'm going to start a loop. Let's start a loop here. And normally we use a as the name of the variable for loops. So a equals 0, a is less than 3, and a plus plus. So now we go inside this loop, and now I'm just going to do something here, console.log, and I'm going to send parent loop And then I'm going to keep track of the value of A. So if we do this, I don't know if I showed you this before, this comma. So instead of concatenating values, we can just use comma. This only works for the console.log. So in this case, we are just going to send these two values to the console. So let's try this and see what do we see there. So now, as you can see, we have parent loop, then we have the value of A of 0, 1, 2, and then our loop ends. But in the previous lessons, we learned that we can do nested loops. So let's say inside here, we want to start another loop. So we are going to start a loop. And then we are just going to use the same variable name. Because, well, after all, it might not affect this variable over here. So let's see if this is true. So now let's just do the same thing, but let's change it to child loop, just so we can make sure what is going on inside our loop. Let's save this. Let's refresh the page. And now, as you can see, something went wrong here because our parent loop just stopped running at 0. Let's go down here so we can see. So we entered the parent loop, then A was 0. So we printed this. Now inside this loop, we have another loop. So this is going to run multiple times, and only when it ends, we're gonna go back to the first one to continue running. But the thing is, we just used the same variable name. So when we finished with this loop, we had A equals 3. This is why we jumped out of this loop. And when we came back here, A was already 3. So we did not enter this loop again. So we had a conflict between these two variables, and this could be a problem. I've seen times where this happened, and then programmers were like hours trying to figure out what the problem is, why we don't have the results we want, only to find out that there was a conflict with variable names. So this is why keeping the local scope is important. But how can we do it with loops if we know that only functions, they have a local scope? Well, that was before ES6. So ES6 is one of the versions of JavaScript. ECMA is the organization that maintains JavaScript and is responsible for creating new versions. So in this version, ES6, they introduced a new keyword called let. So when you are creating a variable, instead of using var, if you use let, it is going to be local inside any block of code inside curly braces. So this means loops and conditionals. So let's try to change our code. Now instead of using the var keyword, let's just use let here and let here. And now what this is going to do is creating a local variable inside this block of code. So this variable is not going to affect this one outside. If we do this and now run the loop again, we can see that now it was much different. So we have the first round of the parent loop, we run it 3 times. Then it just ran again, then we have the child loop running, and then the 3rd time. So one variable did not affect the other. So this is cool, but the problem is that the let keyword or anything from the ES6 version, it's not compatible with some versions of Internet Explorer. And I know this browser is horrible, you should not use this, but the truth is that many people around the world, they just use Internet Explorer. It's not because they're stupid, but it's just because they don't know it's bad. They just buy a computer that comes with Windows and they just have Internet Explorer. So now Microsoft has a new browser that's much better, that is Edge, but some people just have older computers with Internet Explorer and they are just used to click on that icon and they just use it. So if you want to have full compatibility with your website, you should not use the let keyword yet. So in this case, well, the only thing you can do is just using a different variable name. So you have to be a bit careful when using nested loops like this. Just try to always pick different names, and anytime that it's possible, you should use functions, so then you won't have these kinds of conflicts. So now, even using the var keyword, but now we have different variable names, so we won't have any conflict. So let's just save this and let's refresh the page. So now we can see we have the same result using the var keyword. Before we finish this lesson, let me just show you another keyword that was introduced by ES6, which is the constant keyword, or const. These are variables that you don't intend to change. So let's say I have a variable called pi. So pi is a number that's always going to be the same. We should never change it. So if I create it as a constant, so let's just use the const keyword. Now, this is just a regular variable. So this is the value of this constant. Now we can just call it just like a variable, like this. And if we try to change its value, so let's try to assign a new value to it. Now we're going to have an error because we cannot change the value of constants. So this is going to make our code safer, because if someone tries to change this, it means that this person is doing something that's not right. So instead of just continuing and finding out the mistake later, which can be harder to spot, by using the constant when you don't want a variable to be changed, then you are going to have this protection, because when the person tries to do this, this is going to result in an error. But again, the const keyword can also break in some versions of Internet Explorer. So just be a bit careful with it. Now, before we finish, there's just one last thing that I want to show you. So let me just copy this example from the beginning of this video. Let me just comment all this. Now I'm going to do the same thing, just creating a function to assign a name, or to create a variable called name. Let's use a different name here. Let's say my name. Then let's do console.log my name. And now let's try to access the variable from out of here. So now let's just run this function once, just so we can create the variable. And if we refresh the page, we know what's going to happen. So the first time we created the variable, it was used inside the function, but then this is not accessible from outside of this function because of the local scope. However, if we create a variable without the var keyword, so maybe throughout the course, I may have forgotten to use the var keyword. So this is not an error. We won't have an error even if it's the first time we are calling this variable. But the thing is, when we create a variable without the var keyword, no matter if we are inside a function, it is going to be created in the global scope. So now without the var keyword, if we save this and refresh the page, we can see that now we were able to access this variable outside this function. So just be a bit careful and try not to forget the var keyword when you are creating variables. Well, that was all that I wanted to say for the moment. I know this was a lot of stuff, and you might be asking yourself, okay, so what do I do with all this? Well, the purpose of this lesson now was just to show you what is a local and a global scope, how does it work in JavaScript, and when we get more advanced, we're gonna have more opportunities of making use of this concept. So that was all. I'll see you in the next video.